So we trudge on in our commentary on Mark. We're in chapter 11, and this is session 43. And so we are approaching the Temple Act, as I and many others call it, rather than the temple cleansing. It's really a cleansing, I think, in Luke, where he kind of just shushes out only the sellers. He doesn't overturn any tables or anything. Uh, and some of the scholars say that the reason for that activity of Jesus in the temple in Luke 19 is to create a sort of clean space for his teaching in the temple. The temple in Luke is not said to be going to be destroyed. There are no, false witnesses in Luke accusing Jesus of threatening to destroy the temple. That's going to be transferred by Luke to Acts and Stephen. In Luke, the gospel begins and ends in the temple. And the temple only peters out in Acts 21-22 when Paul enters the temple trying to appease these very observant Jews who have taken a vow and have heard that Paul is against the practice of Judaism by Jews. So, as a sign of good faith, Paul goes into the temple a couple of times, and the second time, uh, his accusers, these irate people, think he has introduced, these are Jews having come from Asia in Acts 21, they think he's introduced uncircumcised people to the area of the temple where this is prohibited, even with the support of the Roman law, etc. And a riot ensues, and after that, I say the temple peters out in Luke Acts, that 2-volume work. So in Luke, you have this gradual sort of separation of Jew and Jew who believes in Jesus. And then finally, we go to the Gentiles. They will listen, the very last verses of Acts. This salvation will go to the nations. They will listen. Plan B, instead of keep going to the synagogues where they're largely rejected, etc. That's the story of Luke Acts. John, of course, has a temple cleansing with a reference to Zechariah. You have made my father's house a marketplace, and there will be no Canaanite or seller, merchant in the temple, the end of Zechariah, in 14. So John does have, casting out of heavy animals, large animals. And Jesus is the temple. So we're going to, try to deal with all those interesting comparisons and theologies in a way that's not confusing. So again, there's 4 accounts of a temple act. The simplest one is Luke, with no reference to destruction until Stephen is accused of speaking of a dead Jesus who said he would replace the temple, etc., and change the customs that Moses handed down, which is part of what results in Stephen's death, very parallel to Jesus, and even Paul is parallel to Jesus. So Jesus' disciples in Luke Acts parallel what happens to Jesus. Matthew basically, I think, copies Mark. And John, of course, has a theological view where Jesus is the temple. the talk is not so much of building a new temple, but raising the temple. Reference to resurrection clearly in John chapter 2. And so I just wanted to mention those differences to have an understanding of how much redaction there is in the Gospels. You may have a kernel of historical fact that is then presented and elaborated differently by each of the four evangelists. And it's incredibly important to understand the theology and the literary vehicle by which it has been transmitted, so that that's kind of a background to understanding what exactly happened. Most people, I think, picture an indignant Jesus with a whip, that's only in John, casting out sellers in the temple because there should be no commerce in the temple. In my dissertation, I cover those things. I will probably show you sooner or later a page or so, at least a paragraph by, I think, E.P. Sanders, who's a major scholar, saying that the purpose of the temple was really sacrifice. The purpose of the temple was not to sort of look away from sacrifice like E.P. Sanders, who's a Protestant, says most Protestants like to do. Sacrifice is bad, teaching is good, prayer is good, so the temple is for prayer and maybe teaching, but sacrifice looked the other way. They ignore that. No, the temple was basically for sacrificing animals. And the less chance that they would be blemished, hurt, rendered unacceptable for temple sacrifice, the less of a chance of that, the better, and the closer you could sell them to the place where they were going to be sacrificed, the better. There's a whole debate as to whether this was taking place outside the temple, but or should have taken place, totally outside the temple, and merchants had kind of crept into an area of the temple. Certainly was the court of Gentiles. Certainly was, I think it was beyond the hell, this division area, where it's not really a holy part of the temple. But the point being that I think that all those debates are not important. I think we're going to see in Mark, which is our main concern, that the presentation in Mark is that the time of the temple, or the season of the temple, or the kairos of the temple, is reflected in the kairos of the fig tree. It's over. That time is over. There's going to be a new temple. This temple has been built by human hands, which in the Bible is synonymous of idolatry. That's what Stephen actually says in Acts 6. He says that Yahweh, went around in tents, etc. But Solomon built him a house, as if to imply that Yahweh really didn't want a house, a building. If you look at the account in 2 Samuel 7, which is very important, David is very comfortable in his cedar house. He wants to build the Lord a temple, a house. Nathan is the prophet. Nathan at first says, go ahead, God has blessed you and do what you think. But then he has a dream where God says, I have never wanted a house. I've always gone in tents from place to place. I've always tented among my people. And Yahweh then says, I am going to build you a house. I am going to give you a dynasty. And so you have this promise that the Davidic, royal, messianic, if you will, dynasty will remain in the line of David. He will not remove his chesed, his favor, so to speak, as he from Solomon or David's descendants, as he did with Saul, the first king. And so it's an unconditional covenant with David, which is, many scholars believe it's really the basis of this eternal covenant that the priestly school will adopt, which is really without a condition. It will not be broken like the conditional covenant of the Deuteronomic school, where it's a contract. These are the stipulations. You break it, these are the consequences. The eternal covenant, that one is unbreakable, more of a promise. That's what Paul emphasizes, that this covenant with Abraham is more of a promise rather than a conditional pact. Of course, with history, this will be tweaked. And Psalm 132 will say, if they keep my covenant, etc., because experience has shown that, in fact, with the Babylonian conquest, there probably was some sort of interruption in the Davidic succession, a real blip or glitch or bump in the succession road. And so this conditional covenant with David is in some areas of the Bible kind of made to have, if you look at Psalm 132, verse 12, if your sons keep my covenant, it's a big if, huh? And the, some sort of testimony that I teach them, then their sons forever will sit on your throne. That's a conditional covenant. In any case, we got into that because of the fact that there is this tradition in the Bible that, and Stephen reflects that. If you look at Acts 7:48, it says the Most High does not dwell in houses made by men, as the prophet says, the heaven is my throne, the earth my footstool. What house are you going to build me? Or what will be the place of my rest? This is in Isaiah. Incredibly interesting inner community divisions. I took that course with Joseph Blenkings up at the Biblicum in Rome, just on Isaiah 56 through 66. There's a great book by Scrum, The Opponents of Third Isaiah. And what you have is around the temple, a group of Jews and a form of Judaism which will have opponents, just like you have Sadducees and Pharisees opposed. In fact, Paul uses that division to try to get out of the jam he's in Acts 22, 21, 22. He sees that the assembly, the Sanhedrin, is divided between Pharisees and Sadducees, and he says, I'm a Pharisee. And so he divide and conquer. So that you have this tradition that the temple was not the most kosher, so to speak, thing in Judaism. I think the Pharisees and Jews will agree with me, some Jews will agree with me, that the Pharisees breathed a sigh of relief when the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees were out of power, and no more animal sacrifice until Messiah comes. Don't hold your breath. But you study the Torah. So that I want to give a background, especially for people that are not familiar with the fact that you have different schools of thought on the temple. And certainly Isaiah 66, right at the end of Isaiah, is an anti-temple passage. Uh, you know, even though the book is not going to be against the temple per se, this line, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples, from the beginning of Isaiah 56, third Isaiah, so to speak, um, does refer to sacrifices and also refers to the opening up of the temple to foreigners. Not gerim, like resident aliens with maybe a green card or something, but real foreigners, which is a real, Blankings have called it prophetic abrogation of the Torah. In other words, third Isaiah allows not only foreigners, but eunuchs, which presumably would be men with mutilated penises, excuse my French, which is what is prohibited forever in Deuteronomy 23. Any man with a crushed testicles or a mutilated penis or a mamzer, a bastard, as Jesus was accused of being, will never be admitted into the assembly of Yahweh. Neither will the Ammonite or Moabite. You have other schools that admit Ruth, and the rabbis come and say, well, that only applies to women Moabites. And then you have the book of Judith, a Jewish book, rejected by the Jewish canon, accepted by the Catholic canon, where an Ammonite, Achior, is admitted into the assembly. So I want to emphasize the diversity of schools in ancient Judaism, if you want to call it that, with certainly a centralization under the rabbinic form of Judaism. Just like in Christianity, all the heretics are kind of wiped out for centuries, slowly. The Jews have their own Protestants, as you may know, the Karaites, who don't believe in the Pharisaic halakha, the oral tradition. They believe in written scripture and some other ways of understanding the will of God. So I wanted to give that background on diversity, so that we don't have a real monolithic, oversimplified view of what the temple represents. And with this sort of leisurely approach to what Jesus is going to do at 18 minutes or so, I'm going to stop, and we'll have, opportunity, I hope, to continue later, next time.